Hello everyone. I'll continue the series on the Sicilian Defense with the Grand Prix Attack, which is one of the, I think, best ways for white to surprise black, and perhaps the most fun way for white to play against the Sicilian if you don't want to go into the open lines. And definitely a variation which isn't that common. I mean, it isn't common because the engines will say that black equalizes right out of the opening and that white doesn't have any advantage. But I mean, white has so many attacking ideas that they more than compensate for the loss of the opening advantage according to the engine. So I think that Grand Prix should be played regardless of your level, and that it could be a great weapon even for grandmasters. So after e4, c5, white doesn't go for knight to f3 or c3. White plays knight to c3, going into the closed Sicilians. And now, after knight to c6, I played this variation a couple of times. I played bishop to b5 immediately. This is continuing the closed Sicilian, but I would then transpose to the Grand Prix later on. But the normal Grand Prix move order is after knight to c6, f4 immediately. This is the Grand Prix. And with the move f4, white is preparing to have a simple attacking setup, and your attacking setup is always going to be similar or even the same, regardless of what your opponent does. Now, there are a couple of things that you have to remember. Now, your king is almost always going to be castling kingside. That's one thing. Castling queenside in the Grand Prix isn't really that common because white is weakened on the queen side and black has a ready-made attack with his pawns storming on your queen side. So your king is most often going to be castling king side. Secondly, your plan is as follows. After moving the pawn to f4, your knight is going to f3. Your other knight is of course on c3. You're going to play d3. You're going to castle, and your queen is going to go to e1. And the move queen to e1 is one of the most famous features of the Grand Prix and some other lines. And the point of the move queen to e1 is to prepare the queen coming to h4 and attacking your opponent's king side. So these are some common ideas you should bear in mind. And your main weaknesses, I would say, are the c2 pawn and your light squared bishop. And that's why in most variations of the Grand Prix, white is going to play bishop to b5 and then bishop to c4 if the bishop is chased away, and then white is going to try to exchange this bishop for this knight. How do I change the colors? Okay, like this. You change the bishop for this knight, and strategically you are better because your pawn chain is going to be on the light squares. You have the pawns on c2, d3 and e4, which makes it pretty hard for black to attack along the light squares, and that means that your light square defender is better off out of the box and exchanged for black's knight, which once your pawns are on c2, d3 and e4 could have a very comfortable square on d4, and there isn't really a good way to challenge him besides with your f3 knight, which is needed in the defense, and you shouldn't really exchange it. So your main strategic plans are to castle kingside, get your queen to e1 to prepare an attack, exchange your light squared bishop if possible, play d3, you are going to develop your bishop either to d2 or to e3, that will depend on the situation. Okay, now let's continue. Black has two normal replies in this position. The first one is g6, the second one is e6. This is slightly uncommon. I will just go over this variation once again. After knight to c6, you can play this move bishop here, and after the knight goes to d4, bishop here, black can play a couple of different moves. I think the most common way to play is either g6 or e6, or sometimes d6. And I think e6 is the best way, and then you play f4 and knight to f3, so you can transpose to the Grand Prix like that. And that's technically still a traditional closed Sicilian, but after f4 in this line, the engines don't recognize this as the Grand Prix anymore, but I think they should, but just a digression. Okay, let's go back. So knight c6, f4 immediately, the Grand Prix, g6 or e6. Let's go over e6 first. Now the move e6 is preparing d5. That's fairly obvious and simple. If your opponent plays e6, that means that he's going to be developing his knight either to e7 or to f6, and you can't really know. And the second thing is that the bishop can still fianchetto despite black moving the e6 pawn. He can still go g6 and bishop to g7. But in most cases in this line, black is going to play bishop d7 and knight to f6. Now to this you have to react with knight to f3. You have to start developing your kingside pieces in order to castle, and black is best advised to play d5 immediately here, so d5. And now to this, you might think that the move e5 is good, or perhaps even d4. I think the best option here is to simply continue your development, because black isn't really threatening to take or to cramp your knight with the move d4. I think that the move bishop to b5 is the best move, because now if black pushes here, then you simply play knight here, and e3 isn't an option because bishop e3, so you are okay here, and the black center would be too weak. So after the move bishop to b5, black should play knight to f6, and here you could play e5, but I think taking on c6 is technically much stronger to weaken black's control of the center, and as I said, exchanging this bishop for the knight. So bishop c6, bc6, and now e5 chasing the knight away, and the knight should go to d7. Of course, going to e4 isn't as good, even though it's dislodging your knight, but after a move such as knight to g5, you're going to recapture the pawn, perhaps even queen to e2, and black is going to be a pawn down. So knight to d7 is the best move, and here you have to continue with your plan, which we discussed. So now d3, developing the bishop, castling, queen to e1. This is your plan. So d3 first, bishop e7, both sides castle, queen to e1. Now we can see that on the d1 square, the queen was useless, and now it can slide over to the king side and cause a lot of problems for black. Now, in some positions in the Grand Prix, it isn't uncommon for white to push h4, g4, g5, h5, and to start an attack like that. So the queen is supporting the move h4 also. And in many variations, you are going to play f5 if the position allows it. So Grand Prix is one of the best attacking tries for white to play against the Sicilian, and this is one of the rare positions in the Sicilian in which white is most commonly going to have the initiative. And black doesn't really have that much counterplay. Black is technically equal or even slightly better, but if white manages to get an attack going, then white will stand great. Here the best move for black is c4. Now dc4, bishop a6, you don't have to recapture immediately. And this is a fun line I analyzed in which white gives up the exchange. This isn't theory anymore, this is just a line I found. I mean, after dc4, black can recapture immediately, of course, but bishop to a6 is better. And now there's a line for white to sacrifice the exchange, which I like. So cd5, bishop takes f1, and now you don't recapture the bishop, of course, you take on e6, and you attack both the bishop and the knight. So in this position, bishop to c4 would be the best move, and now e takes d7, queen takes d7, and after bishop to e3, white has two pawns for the exchange. Of course, I mean, the position is equal. Black does have the bishop pair and the two rooks, but I think your knights are great in this position, and they are very mobile. They have the e4 square. This is a great strength in the position. And they also have a lot of squares such as g5, d4, etc. So I think the knights are great in this position, especially along the dark squares, which aren't really that weak, because white still has the dark squared bishop, so white can have a lot of play. Okay, so that was the move e6, and I think this variation is slightly uncommon, so if you see that, just remember your normal developing plan. Knight to f3, after d5, don't react to this, play bishop to b5, knight f6, bishop takes, take the exchange, always exchange your light squared bishop if you can for the knight on c6, that's always a good idea in the Grand Prix. So bc6, e5, knight d7, d3, bishop e7, castle, queen e1, this is your plan, and the bishop is most likely going to go to e3, but remember not to put it on e3 when your knight is here, because you lose a piece. Okay, so let's go back. After f4, the most common reaction for black is the move g6, preparing to fianchetto the bishop, and in this variation the knight is almost always going to go on f6, of course, because you don't want to play both e6 and g6, but knight e7 can be played as well. So after g6, knight to f3, bishop to g7, bishop to b5, once again trying to exchange the knight for the bishop for the knight, and here black doesn't have to allow it. Now the only move for black in this position is the move knight to d4, and this is where the position branches out. Now before continuing, We just went over the move bishop to b5. I would like to cover two sidelines for white first. Even though bishop to b5 is by far the most commonly played move and technically the best move, there are two moves which could be okay. There's one which leads to a very aggressive continuation, and that's bishop to c4. Now after bishop c4, e6 should be played because black has to protect the f7 square. And after this, white can either play passively with castles, which I wouldn't recommend after the move bishop to c4, because this is now just way too passive for white. And in a position such as this one, white doesn't really have any attacking chances, and this is almost -1 for black. Black is going to get the strong bishop on the long diagonal and just crush white. But after bishop c4, e6, there's a great move for white, and that's the move f5. Now technically, this is equally bad as castles on move 6, but at least it gives you a lot of attacking prospects and it can confuse your opponent. Now the best move here, which I'm not sure many players with black would find, most would take, I believe, is knight g to e7. And now to this you take fe and de and now d3. And now you have weakened black's kingside somewhat. You have provoked a lot of weaknesses. You can see that the position is weak. And after b6, which is the best move, and castling, you see that white has great pieces here. Okay, the rook is staying here, the queen is going to get to e1, and here this bishop is a monster and it's not really easy to evict it. So I believe that white has a lot of prospects in this position. And after the move bishop to c4 on move 5 at e6, I would recommend the move f5. Now the other sideline after bishop to g7 is the move g3, and this is the slowest way to play the Grand Prix, I think, and I wouldn't recommend it, but still, if you want to have a safer game and perhaps get your opponent out of his opening preparation if he knows that you play the Grand Prix, this could be a great surprise weapon. So now after g3, once again the most common move is e6, now bishop to g2, you played g3 because you want to fianchetto. Knight g e7, castles, castles, d3, d5. And black is playing d5 here as in many variations of the Grand Prix because he has to get this central break in. If he doesn't, then white has a lot more control. Now, to d5 we don't really have to react. I believe that taking is almost always a bad move. I mean, not a bad move, but a less than ideal move. e5 is better in most situations, but you also want to be careful with the move e5 because you want to have a chance to play f5 if needed. So I believe that you should be careful when deciding what to do with the pawns. And there really isn't one rule which could apply to all positions. You should assess the position carefully and be aware of what will happen if black captures and if black pushes the pawn. So these are the two things that you always have to look out for in the Grand Prix. So bishop c4 and g3 on move 5, sidelines for white. Now let's go back to the main line. Bishop g7, bishop b5. Knight to d4, only move for black. And now white has 3 moves. One of them is castles, which I think is the most common and technically the best move. a4 is the engine choice, which, okay, is preparing to open up the rook if black decides to capture, but doubles white's pawns. And one last move is knight takes d4 here instead of a4 or castling. I think that after knight to d4, white should simply castle. And once again, you want to exchange this bishop for this knight. And if the knight captures, then the knight has lost the tempo virtually. So I think that white should be happy if black takes here and you capture... wait, after castles. If knight takes on b5, I think that knight takes b5 is a great position for white, and black does get d5 in, but it's still okay. But let's go over the sidelines first. So castles is the best move, and after knight d4, a4, black should of course play a6, and the bishop should retreat to c4, nowhere else, and now e6, and the position continues normally. The only thing is that the moves a6 and a4 have been interposed, as opposed to the bishop c4 move on move 5, and there isn't really much difference to the position. Now after knight to d4, you can also take on d4, so knight takes d4, c takes d4, knight to e2, and now the best move for black, which is slightly counterintuitive, is knight to h6. Well, I mean, not that counterintuitive, because after knight to f6 you can push with e5, and here you castle. And I believe that this is also good for white. Your bishop is slightly misplaced because you want to play the move d3, and you haven't managed to exchange your bishop, but you can play bishop c4, a3, and prepare to tuck your bishop away if needed, and you still have an okay position. Then you still have a bishop pair as opposed to many Grand Prix positions, but still, I think that castling on move 6 is the best idea, because if you castle, you have provoked the move knight takes b5, and if black plays knight to d4, trying to chase your bishop away, and you just castle, and if he returns with the knight back to c6, then that's just a waste of 2 tempi. Now, if he captures, then he lost the tempo to capture the bishop you wanted to exchange anyway, so I think that's strategically okay for white. Even though the engines would say this is equal or slightly better for black, I think you've managed to achieve what you wanted out of the position, and you exchanged your reverse piece. And now, after you play the move d3, you're going to have a pawn structure along the light squares, and your light square bishop won't be in the way anymore. So now, of course, knight b5, and here there are two moves for black. One passive move, one active move. The passive way to play this position would be d6, and after this d3, knight f6, queen to e1. White is once again continuing with his normal plan, d3, queen to e1, preparing to get to h4. But after knight takes b5, black should play d5, immediately striking in the center. Even though this might look weakening, and you might think you are putting your queen out too soon, because what happens if e takes d5, queen takes, and here knight gains a tempo? First of all, black could capture with the bishop, which he probably wouldn't want to do, and secondly, the queen can just return back, it's not that bad, or even go to c6. But after d5, the most common move for white, by far, is the move e5. There's one sideline though, and that's e takes d5, which I wouldn't recommend. I think this is too weakening. Now the best move for black is a6, now knight to c3, of course, knight to f6, d4, you have to give up your extra pawn, of course. Now knight takes d5, d takes c5, knight takes c3, queen takes d8, king takes d8, b takes c3, bishop takes c3, rook b1, king c7, and now after bishop b2, bishop takes, rook takes. The position is equal, and that's why I think white shouldn't go for that. The number of pawns is equal, but your c pawn is horrible on c5, and you are most likely going to lose it. And it's equal, but the only side that could win is black, in my opinion. So after the move d5, I would recommend you don't take on d5, because it could only lead to a slightly better drawing position for black. So after d5, play e5, close down the position and lock down black's best piece, the bishop on g7. That's my recommendation. So after e5, black will once again continue with a6, chasing the knight away. There's another move. Well, okay, a6 is supposed to chase the knight away to c3. So now you might wonder what happens if black plays d4 first. Now that isn't as good, because now white can play c3, and after a6, the knight doesn't really mind going to a3, so knight a3, d3 isn't really scary, because now knight to e1, you can't play this because knight takes c4, knight h6, queen to f3 are going to capture the pawn, bishop e6, knight takes d3, c4, knight to b4, rook to b8. And in this position, of course, white is a pawn up. It's not the safest pawn in the world, but it's a pawn up, and this is almost +1. So that's why I'd recommend black to play after the move e5 to play a6 immediately, and d4 is a mistake, because getting the knight to a3 isn't really so threatening. So after e5, if you're black, play a6. Now to a6, knight to c3 should be played, getting back with the knight. Bishop to g4, pinning white's knight on f3. And now you can play either d4 or queen to e1. I think queen to e1 is not the best move here. I think d4 should be played. And after c takes d4, you can play either queen takes d4 or knight to e2. Of course, d3 isn't a threat, and you would much rather recapture with the knight, because in this position, after queen takes d4, black will have to develop the knight to h6 anyway, and now you stand to gain to serve as a tempo gain for black. So I think playing knight to e2 and recapturing with the knight is much better, because you will be controlling the f5 square, which is technically the weakest square in your position. Okay, so white's main problems, of course, are f5 and d4, and if you can manage to, from this position after c takes d4, play this, and let's say black develops here, you recapture here, now you are controlling the square at least a bit. And of course, black doesn't have the c pawn to chase your knight away. So this would be the end of the main line in the Grand Prix. I wouldn't like to go any deeper because you never know basically how the situation, how the position is going to branch out. But you have to remember a few key points now. First of all, you always aim to exchange your light squared bishop. Let me go back. You aim to exchange your light squared bishop for black's knight on c6. So that's one thing. Secondly, you are trying to play the move d3. You are going to play knight to f3. You're going to castle kingside, play queen to e1, and prepare queen to h4. And you're going to develop your bishop either to d2 or to e3. And this is your setup that you are aiming for. And there isn't really much black can do about it. So just remember what you have to do, get your attacking setup. And then after you get to about here, well, let's say here, you have to be prepared to risk a lot in the Grand Prix. Now, you should note that, of course, this diagonal is weak. You could have problems along this diagonal. Sorry, this diagonal. So a move such as c3 can sometimes be played. Bishop to d3 can be played to strengthen it anyway. And you have to be prepared to play moves such as queen to e1, let's say h3, chasing the bishop away, g4, queen to h4, and starting an attack. A move such as knight to g5, perhaps even playing the move f5, sacrificing here. And the Grand Prix is a very attacking setup for white, and it's supposed to be you aren't supposed to invest in defense in this opening, and you are supposed to create an attack which will be faster than your opponents and not worry too much about defending. So this is an opening I would recommend for dynamic attacking tactical players because it often gives a lot of possibilities for tactical chess and attacking chess. Okay, that's basically it. I hope you got something from this video about the Grand Prix. I will continue the Sicilian series with the Najdorf. I'm going to be making 2 videos, one on the main line and one on the sidelines, perhaps 2 or 3 variations in each video in depth, and they're going to be slightly longer than usual, and they are going to be out in about 2 or 3 days. Thanks very much for watching, everybody, and stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye.